It's a great pleasure for us to have Professor Ricardo Polosa here with us to share his presentation. So the floor is yours, Ricardo.
Yep. First off, thank you very much for this kind invitation in Ankara, in Turkey. I've never been to Ankara before, so I'm very excited. More than my talk, just to see what this incredible country has to reveal. I've been to Turkey many times, but usually it's the obvious destination, meaning Antalya, Izmir, Istanbul, so forth. So Ankara is different. Today, we are going to talk, do you see me guys there? I mean, you don't have to see me, but can you hear me well? Hello? From the other side of the world? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, okay. We can hear your voice.
Okay, so one of the major problems today is that, let's face it, smoking is not going to go. And, you know, we had 1.1 billion smokers in 2020. We're already reaching 2025. We are still 1.1 and maybe a little bit more. Of course, to this pool, LMICs, low middle income countries, will contribute a big deal because, of course, we are registering some success in westernized world, for example, in the US, okay? And this is thanks to very intensive tobacco control strategies. However, tobacco control strategies globally do not seem to work very much, and we need a change. We need to switch gear, okay? And thanks to the innovation, we now have the opportunity of using new generation products that will deliver nicotine without causing problems. And when I say causing problems, I mean without emitting more than 8,000 chemicals that they are known to cause smoking-related disease. So we are transitioning, or actually we already transitioned from an era where it was just quit or die to a new era where you have a third option, an alternative option, just because we have new products that were not available 10, 15 years ago, at least not en masse. And it is very important to recognize that one of the key principles upon which tobacco harm reduction is founded is that nicotine does not cause any of these problems. Nicotine is not cancerogenic, doesn't cause respiratory disease, and it may be potentially risky only for people with decompensated coronary problems, for example, early after surviving a myocardial infarction. And this story is nothing new. This was said by the very father of tobacco harm reduction, late Professor Mike Russell, who stated many times people smoke for nicotine but die from tar. Unfortunately, if you look at the recent surveys conducted, in this case in the United States, in well over 3,600 health professionals, you will see that many of these people will not clearly have an understanding of nicotine in terms of its harm reduction potential. For example, look here. Oh my God. 75% of these distinguished physicians will still believe that nicotine will cause, you cannot read it here because I have this funny thing that somebody put it up, will suffer from atherosclerosis directly because of nicotine. Nobody was thinking about combustion emissions. Wow, never mind. So there's quite a long way to go in terms of education. Am I speaking too fast for you people over there in the box? Okay. I will try to keep my
fine.
semantics very
All
simple.
good, all good.
All's good.
Sorry?
All is good.
One of the key themes, the strategic key themes in tobacco harm reduction is to understand smoking cessation and electronic cigarettes. Quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about this in 2024 is a little bit rhetorical because there's so much evidence out there that I would actually completely skip the story. But because we are here in Ankara, many of you will not know the story, I will show the evidence. And the evidence derives from a triangulation of studies, like randomized control studies published in high impact factor journals, from population studies, and on top of everything, from systematic reviews with meta-analysis, primarily those published consistently by the Cochrane Library. I'm not sure if this distinguished audience know what a Cochrane Library is, but just to make it simple, is the Bible of all medical studies. So if you want to know about, let's say, the effect of aspirin and its side effects, you just look up the Cochrane Library, and the Cochrane Library will tell you exactly how effective is a drug and how and what's the tolerability threshold. So we do have incredible evidence, but I think the most strong evidence now derives not only from the randomized controlled studies that have a limitation. Randomized controlled studies, particularly in the area of behavioral science, have the limitation that they are rigid, rigorous, but not really realistic. For example, many of the studies, randomized controlled trials in the Cochrane, are made by people which are highly selected. They are going to be paid to participate in the study, and they're going to receive the drug or the electronic cigarette for free. My question to you, does this happen in real life? No. And if you don't have a monetary incentives or a product incentives, will you see the same good results? Obviously not. So it is good to triangulate also population studies, real-world evidence derived from real-world data. I'm not going to spend the rest of the afternoon talking about the ample evidence, but I'm just focusing on a couple of papers. This one is particularly sexy, okay? This has been published, I guess, a few months ago by Flo Foxen and colleagues, and she was basically taking federal data, federal US data, so open database of population study representative of United States. It is called the National Health Interview Survey. About 870 plus thousands people being surveyed in this national survey. And she did something very interesting, but to me not unexpected. This is a trend line of smoking prevalence over time. Can you see that? Over something like 32 years. And you will see that the trend line is going down clearly because tobacco control approaches have been shifting the norm in the US in relation to the use of tobacco smoking. And at a certain point here there is the appearance of new generation products, specifically vaping, at around 2007, 2008, okay? And you will see that with the growing with the widespread growing popularity of vaping, so with the increase of vaping prevalence, there is an acceleration of the expected decrease in smoking prevalence. So the use of vaping has been an accelerator of exiting out of smoking, a gateway out of smoking, as you can see here. The authors have been clever enough to do a sensitivity analysis. So what they did, move it. No, it doesn't. What? Just wanted to advance, but it doesn't. Can you just do it manually for me? Yeah. So they did a sensitivity analysis by looking into age subpopulations. This age subpopulation is 1834. Why is this interesting for vaping specifically? Because this is the age strata where most people will use electronic cigarette. You don't see 70 or 80 years old vaping. You see mostly young adults vaping. And you can see immediately, without even showing the previous slide, that the acceleration is even more marked because the vaping uptake is accelerated as well. And there is a crossover, meaning now, 2020 to 2022, there'll be more young adults vaping than smoking. This is what I call the door to the eradication of smoking. And to me, that I've been fighting against smoking all of my life, this is one of the best news. Nice story to tell. And this is basically the same story using a different data sets. As a counterfactual, let's have a look at the elderly people. So Flo-Foxon was clever enough to do the counterfactual. So let's look what happens to elderly people and what is the vaping impact on smoking. There's no impact in the decline, on the constant decline of smoking prevalence over the years in the US in this population. And why? Because there's no uptake of vaping. Okay? This is the counterproof. And of course, the same is happening at the population level in many, many countries. For example, UK, the United Kingdom has embraced vaping, and since has embraced vaping, has accelerated the decline in smoking prevalence. More recently, New Zealand has also moved into a policy that supports and promotes vaping. It is called Vape to Quit Strong. It's a governmental-backed policy that allows people in New Zealand to acquire vaping products, if they're smokers, of course, and these vape products are subsidized. And let's look what this creates in New Zealand. New Zealand, there were already a fairly reduced smoking prevalence rate, because they've been implementing tobacco control policies very strongly. They invest a lot in tobacco control policies. And the point of question was, will the introduction of tobacco harm reduction in a country where already has a very low prevalence of smoking, is this going to make any difference? Apparently so. This is when the government has started the program, and you will see an uptake of vaping prevalence across a couple of years, but at the same time, there seems to be a strong deceleration in an acceleration in the decline of smoking prevalence. Another area of great interest is the hardcore smokers. For example, smokers with schizophrenia. You all know that for this vulnerable population, there's very little we can do. So we implement, even in my hometown, in my institution, we implement the smoking cessation programs that they are doomed to fail, one after the other. And the reason is that these people, for many different reasons, they will need their nicotine fix, they will need their oral interaction with the product, and they just love it or they just can't do without it. So, and they die. They die because they smoke a lot. On average, they smoke more than double than the smoking in the general population. So they are doomed to be condemned to develop smoking-related diseases very quickly, okay? What are the strategy here? Well, the strategy would be to integrate, to realize that this serious harm from heavy smoking, difficulty in cessation, will create a strong ethical case for alternatives. There is no point in insisting in traditional smoking cessation methods that they are doomed to fail or that we know they are not working, okay? So, strong ethical case to try something different. This lesson has been taken up again in the UK by the Mental Health NHS Trust, where 91% of these people with mental illnesses are allowed to use electronic cigarettes. Why is that? Because these people are pragmatists and they know for sure that the traditional smoking cessation programs will never work. So they'll try electronic cigarettes. What is the outcome of using electronic cigarettes in people with mental disease? The evidence is sparse. There's not very much. We started a long time ago, more than 10 years ago, with a pilot study on 14 people with schizophrenia or schizoaffectoid disorders. We provided 4 weeks supplies of a product, which was not the best product in the world. Try to think that this study was published in 2013. Basically, we were using products that were on the market in 2010. And 15 years ago, the vaping products were not as good as the one that we have today. Very poor performance. You need to recharge you needed to recharge the electronic cigarette 4 times a day. Ridiculously challenging. But nevertheless, we had a 14% quit rate at 1 year. Not bad. Not compared to a 0. Other people have been following our idea. Sarah Pratt from US used the schizophrenic and bipolar population, again a small study, again 4 weeks supply, and they found more or less 10%, but this time at an early time point. So most probably this was doomed to fail on a long term. Then again, other authors, more later, we probably different population, in this case with psychosis, poor outcome. Then we repeated again our experience with people with schizophrenia more recently by using this time the best electronic cigarette that was available on the market at that time. And I'm referring to the Juul at 5.5% nicotine, so very high content. Using very performant electronic cigarette, we obtained 40% quit rate in a very difficult population at 3 months. Sarah Pratt, most recently, on a very large population with 8 weeks supply of a similar product, obtained a similar success. So, I mean, we are right on track. We need more studies, obviously, or maybe better products that are suited to people with mental diseases. We learned a few lessons. The first one is the combination of the high nicotine strength and efficient product design may lead to a difference, will make the difference. If I use sloppy products, we are not going to get any results. We need good products. So if we provide adequate compensatory biophysical effects, which is the nicotine fix, plus a good behavioral effects, which refers to smoking rituals, probably I will have eventually a good relapse prevention tool, because that's the key of the problem. People are quitting smoking every day. The problem is they relapse the following day. So we, more than a smoking cessation tool, we really need a relapse prevention tool. And that's what an electronic cigarette is made for. Based on this, we designed an international trial, which is ongoing. So, in conclusion, for this part, all I can say is that if we consider the effect of smoking cessation, and if we model the smoking cessation success in different populations, we end up making predictions like this. Here, David Levy in Georgetown University predicted 6.6 million fewer premature deaths if you promote tobacco harm reduction and vaping in the US. Here, in other data from Peter Lee from the UK, confirms what David Levy in Washington, D.C. was actually presenting. Of course, these are models, and models will depend in the estimate, but the same thing can be said in terms of health economics. Here, Professor Francesco Moscone from Brunel University and Ca' Foscari University has created two scenarios for the UK, actually for England, where 10% of smokers switch to electronic cigarette, and he mapped the anticipated saving for every single health region. Of course, if the scenario includes 50% of smokers switching to electronic cigarette, the saving will be much, much higher. Okay, so it seems to be all good news, right? Right? Wrong. Wrong, because if the WHO comes with tweets like this, that vape kills, this will deactivate all the efforts of the modelers. You know, the modelers are just saying that the vaping products are, on average, 80% less toxic than cigarettes. But the WHO thinks in a different way. So you see tweets like this stating that vape kills, when in reality there's not a single case of a human that has subdued to electronic cigarettes. But that's another story, and this story leads to another key theme, which is what are the health effects of electronic cigarettes, and what can be their impact in terms of health economics. Okay, let's explore this. Let me reiterate a little bit of the story that I said before about tobacco harm reduction. So, combustion, cigarettes, will generate more than 8,000 chemicals. These are responsible for smoking-related disease. These are medical textbooks. We've been studying this for 50 years. We know the toxicology. We know the pathogenesis of this disease. Full stop. So if I quit smoking, there'll be no emission, there'll be no exposure to human body, and there'll be probably reduced harm, although it's very difficult to measure in some cases. What happened if I switch? If I switch, the situation is is this one that you can see, reduced emission, reduced exposure, and again, very difficult to measure reduced harm in the short term. You need long-term study. But you see, reduced exposure, there was no emission, no exposure. This is reduced exposure, reduced emission, because there are million and million of pages that the FDA has scrutinized about these two particular points. And the FDA has stipulated that these products can provide a benefit in terms of public health. Okay. So the real problem now, we are convinced about emission, we are convinced about exposure. What about harm? Okay, if I switch to an electronic cigarette, am I going to feel better, worse? What's going to happen to me in 10 years? These are the critical questions that remains unanswered. I'll try to attempt to answer some of those, okay? The approach is multiple. Now, how many minutes do I have? No, just give me how many minutes do I have? Huh? 10 minutes, I'll make it 10. So there are different strategies. I can use in vitro cytotoxicity and mutagenicity studies, so in vitro studies is a model. Another model is to use epidemiology and in silico science. And finally, clinical studies. They are more close to my heart because after all, I'm a medic, I'm a clinician, and I look after smokers. So I just show you this one because I think it's a very important study looking at the cytotoxicity of cells exposed to new generation product versus tobacco cigarette. So this is zero death line, and this a lot of death, a lot of cell toxicity here. And you see here different products, heat no burn, electronic cigarettes. So there's actually zero toxicity, no cell cytotoxicity, little one here, but certainly not as much as in this case. The beauty of this study is that all these dots are different labs. They are using the same equipments here, the same standard operating procedure, the same protocols, the same training, they had the same training, and they're testing exactly the same products. So one of the problems of replicability of science here is highly minimized. So I think that's the reason why this is one of the most important studies in the world about cytotoxicity. And the same is being done for mutagenicity. So you will see the cigarette here, tobacco cigarette, will create a lot of mutants, meaning a lot of chances of developing tumor, whereas even if I puff up to 350 puffs a day of an electronic cigarette, there's basically no change. Epidemiology, I really want to spend 1 second and 1 minute on snus. These are the lung cancer mortality for several European countries. The big difference between this country here, which is Sweden, and the others is that this country over the years has been regularly and constantly substituting tobacco smoke with this product. This product provides an intake of high intake of nicotine. It's a little sachet that you place inside your mouth, and it's called snus, or oral nicotine product. Okay, this product is very common and widespreadly used by young people, even old people in Sweden, and has clearly contributed to very low lung cancer mortality, and not only, even very low cardiovascular mortality. In all European countries, including Denmark, which is a neighboring country, they are also Scandinavians, by law, by European law, cannot use snus because it's banned for some strange reason. I will skip this and I will go straight to clinical studies. When I think of clinical studies, I try not to repeat the classical scheme or randomized control studies, and because after all, one of the problems is to demonstrate harm. And as I said before, harm, the box harm had a question mark. Very difficult to demonstrate harm in an unhealthy population, a reduction in harm in a healthy population. If I take an healthy population, my spirometry is 100%, so it's normal. Even if I quit smoking, will stay normal. I'm not measuring anything. Okay. My experience in smoking cessation clinics, however, show something very interesting. When you quit smoking, after 48 hours, within 48 hours, you start regaining a lot of sensorial function. For example, I can start tasting food. I can start smelling perfumes, something that was not available before. This means that within 48 hours, my sensorial system, my cells in the primary upper airways are regenerating or can regenerate. So, using this concept, we have devised a little experiment to place a little saccharin tablet at the inferior turbinate level. By doing so, it's minimally invasive. And then asking the patients, the participant, to swallow every minute until she perceives the sweetness in the back of the throat. The function of the time to sweetness is dependent on the function of the cilia. So if the cilia work well, you will perceive the sweetness in the back of your throat in a few minutes. If the cilia are damaged, you will perhaps, sometimes you cannot even, perhaps feel this sweetness in the back of your throat after 15, 20, or 30, even 30 minutes. Takes a long time. And you will see the reason why. Non-smokers have healthy cilia. Yeah. Smokers have desertification of the cilia or deranged cilia. So we did another experiment. So we looked at smokers and we looked at the time. It's called mucociliary clearance transit time, and it's measured by the saccharin test. And you look, the average smokers will be always upper limit normality value, which is 11 minutes. When I did this experiment myself, I was a guinea pig in one of these studies. When we modeled the study, we perfected the study, my MCTT, my time, was 4 minutes. So pretty normal. I don't smoke. So it is logical that never smokers will have very low saccharin transit time at about 6-7 minutes. And the same happens, this is important, former smokers. So people who have been quitting smoking for at least 6 months, there was an inclusion criteria, perform exactly identically as never smokers. And more, those who've been using regularly and exclusively, not dual users, okay? Regularly and exclusively for at least 3 months, electronic cigarette and heated tobacco products had exactly the same performance as never smokers and former smokers. Other model. When you ask people that quit smoking, how do you feel? How can you manage your daily life? They will tell you, doctor, much better. I can now walk 3 flights of stairs. I can do more things. I feel more energetic. I can even go play tennis with my friends. Okay? So, another interesting parameters that can be measured pretty quickly is the aerobic capacity, the VO2 max measurements. If somebody of you is very keen going to the gym, your gym instructor will talk a lot about the VO2 max and capacity. aerobic capacity. You can measure aerobic capacity in many ways, okay? The simplest way is called the Chester step test. You take a person, you set a metronome, and you ask up and down, and the metronome will give you the stepping rhythm. And you then measure heart rate. Then you step up the rhythm and you measure the heart rate. It's different steps until you have data to enter in a formula, and the formula will give you a number, which is the VO2 max. Okay? This is a paper that will come out maybe in next week, so it's fresh from the press, where you will see the VO2 max measurements in 3 different populations. Never smokers, which will perform better than smokers, and former smokers, which will perform exactly identically to never smokers. Okay? So by using this simple method, we are able to distinguish in between these 3 populations. It's a cross-sectional study, so we were not happy. And we went on prospective studies. The prospective study shows that there's an improvement in exercise tolerance already at 4 weeks, but replicated also at week 12. If you are a failure, meaning that you are not able to quit even if I give you the opportunity to switch, you will see your improvement is basically 0, stays the same. But if you are a quitter, meaning if I use heated tobacco products or switching or electronic cigarettes to completely switch away from cigarettes, look at what happens. At 4 weeks already, people are already above the level of clinically important difference, meaning that these changes are not only statistically significant, they are clinically significant. People can perceive it. It's a life-changing experience. Next. It doesn't work. Asena, can you just advance? Okay, and the same, I'll make it short, happens with symptoms, primarily cough. Okay, I don't have to convince you, but this is what happens in a very large switching study. All the smokers, all those who continue to smoke will have a lot of score symptoms, respiratory symptoms, mainly driven by cough. Those who switched with an American product will have much more or less symptoms, primarily cough. In what happens in people who have already a disease, for example, COPD, and these will be the last 3 slides. So these are very interesting global web surveys on over 29,000 people. The author, my friend Konstantinos Farsalinos, identified among these 29,000, 1,062 who had COPD. And the question was very simple. He asked, how about your symptoms? Had they improved since you started using electronic cigarettes? Were worse or stable? And you can see the data in the Apple graph distribution. Of course, this is a self-selected population, so we may not believe 85% of people will really improve. But 40%, wow, that would be already a great advancement. Next. So this was an inspiring piece for me that led to one of the most quoted studies from my group, which is the next, where we show 2 populations. One population of people continuing to smoke and another population of people that acquire by themselves, so real-world evidence, real-world data acquired in the clinics, so real patients, real people, not survey, and they reduce massively the consumption of cigarettes already at the first year, but maintained this reduction over the 5 years. And of course, they improve quality of life, lung function, and most importantly, they reduce by 40% the number of exacerbation, the yearly exacerbation rate. So year by year, there was a reduction in the number of exacerbation rate for these COPD patients. And all you know that the high cost of COPD is associated with hospitalization for exacerbation. And the same was demonstrated also with the heated tobacco products. The follow-up was shorter, but basically we replicated the same evidence, particularly for less respiratory exacerbation, which is an important point. An important point, why? Because this reduction is seen also in other real-world evidence studies. In Japan, for example, where the people has massively moved to reject tobacco combustibles. In fact, more than 50–60% of the population now use heated tobacco products. See what happens. This is a data sets from millions of health records. They say that since there's been an introduction of the heated tobacco products, there's been a strong decline in hospitalization rate for COPD. So this is a proof of my clinical study in a small population, reported in a large population of Japanese using electronic health records. And of course, that's an area where health economists can make a lot of analysis. So in conclusion, I'm sure you can read this yourself. I thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize if I've been taking a little bit more time. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Pelosi, sharing with us these important insights. Very interesting to me. Now, we have three esteemed speakers waiting for us online to share their presentations. So, Professors Helen Matthews, Donald Kenko, and Agus Shrayek Hidayat, if I'm pronouncing correctly.
Yes, it is correct. Definitely.
So, how should we share? Who would like to speak first?
I thought I was, but
Okay.
if that's okay.
All right. Can you share your screen? Yes.
Believe I am now?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
Looks great. Great.
great. And the audio is good as well, I hope.
Audio is good as well.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the technology check, and also thank you for inviting me to participate in this. You know, I was in Ankara last fall and really enjoyed the visit, but unfortunately this year I can only do this by Zoom, but I still appreciate being part of it. I also really appreciate following Professor Ricardo Pelosi because you know, he really helped so much provide the scientific basis for what I sort of take as not as granted, but it's very important research about the scientific background for the reductions in risk associated with these reduced risk nicotine products like e-cigarettes and other ones. So what I'm going to talk about, though, is more of an overview of how to think about cost-benefit analysis of nicotine regulatory policy. See you. I will start with the disclosure that this has been produced with the help of a grant to Cornell University from Global Action to End Smoking. And of course, you know, these are our opinions and not Global Action's, and they don't edit or have any role in any of the analysis here. So As an overview, just to have very basic points about cost-benefit analysis, which will be very familiar to the economist in the room. Cost-benefit analysis is a tool to evaluate whether regulations fix market failures and improve economic efficiency. And it's just very important to think about what economic efficiency is and what it isn't. It's not some maximizing GDP or business profits or something or other. It's a much broader idea that societal resources are allocated to their most highly valued use. Now, any regulation, of course, is going to change that allocation of resources, and they're going to be winners and losers. So the question the cost-benefit analysis addresses is when you change those allocation of resources and you have winners and losers, is it a net benefit? That is, can the winners potentially compensate the losers and still be better off themselves? So that's why benefit cost analysis is so inherently connected to economic efficiency. Again, for the economist in the room, more formally, we'd say that cost-benefit analysis is a way of identifying if a regulation is a potential Pareto improvement, or also called the Cowder-Hicks welfare improvement. And if you really wanted to dive more into it, what you need to do with cost-benefit analysis is to calculate the sum of the compensating variations of income for everyone who either wins or loses because of the regulation. I mentioned market failures here. I also always like to start off, though, with pointing out market success. And this actually is going to echo some of the things that Professor Pelosa mentioned. But the basic idea of market success traces all the way back to 1776's publication by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, that not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. And this is basically saying that markets work to direct industry in such a manner as to produce that which is the greatest value. And this is his famous metaphor of an invisible hand that promotes an end to which was no part of his original intention. And I think there's been a lot of market success in the nicotine product areas, though it's had some trial and error. And as the modern economics would put the invisible hand, is that that's a property of a general equilibrium. And the real world, of course, we're always moving from one general equilibrium to another general equilibrium. And so I like to think about what happened with nicotine markets as this transition towards, a better equilibrium. And the first part of that was just conducting the research and then distributing the research to the consumers about how risky smoking was. And that happened back in the 50s and 60s, and private markets, media markets, played a great role in that, of promoting the fact that, hey, smoking, as we now know, is actually very bad for your health. That immediately created consumer demand for healthier cigarettes. The U.S. market share, for example, in the U.S., the market share of filtered cigarettes went up from about half to almost 100%. While the market share of lower tar cigarettes, went up from virtually nothing to almost 95%. Now, that was a trial and error because those reductions basically had very little or no risk reduction. There's probably some due to sort of a dose-response relationship, but continuing to smoke filtered cigarettes or even lower tar cigarettes continue to have problems. Another market launch in 2022, much more recently, was the very low nicotine cigarettes, the VLN trademark cigarettes. And they have 95% less nicotine than other cigarettes. That was sort of a different kind of a failure. That just hasn't been interesting to consumers. That's basically not a way of reducing health effects of nicotine, but the addiction effects of nicotine, of cigarettes. Because as pointed out, again, decades ago, by the pioneering comment about people smoke for the nicotine but die from the tar. So far getting rid of the tar or lowering some of the tar didn't do enough help. Lowering the nicotine hasn't been popular. But I think we have had great success beginning with the nicotine replacement therapies in the 1980s, the use of snus, first in Sweden, but now in other countries as well, in the US as well, the growing use of e-cigarettes or heated tobacco products, and other products coming on like nicotine pouches. Excuse me. So here's a graph that's somewhat similar to what Flo Floxen did with the US, showing something what's happening in Japan with the total cigarette and heated tobacco shipments. PMI entered the market for Japan, entered the Japanese market in Japan in November 2014 as led by an invisible hand, and the invisible hand led to reductions in smoking. You can see that the Japanese progress in reducing cigarette consumption had kind of stalled out in the 20-teens. But as soon as IQOS came onto the market, the reduction resumed and even steepened. And so it echoes what's seen in a number of other countries. So this is given us the market success where reduced risk nicotine product came on board. However, while this has been happening, market failures continue to limit the success of the market for reducing nicotine. So, the markets are succeeding, but they're not as successful as they could be. And the whole idea of market failures is that people are making inefficient choices, smokers in particular, are making inefficient choices between smoking and reduced risk nicotine products. First of all, in sort of a classical or neoclassical economics, smokers impose negative externalities through secondhand smoke. But they're also a very big problem that smokers are misinformed about the relative and absolute risk of vaping. My colleague Alan Matthews will be talking about that next or soon, I believe. Another area related to market failures is what sometimes people call individual failures. And that is the smokers make decision-making errors and impose internalities on their future selves. And that could be just due to the lack of information, or it could be due to various biases that behavioral economics suggests people may have when they make difficult decisions. For example, decisions about smoking involve, especially quitting smoking, involve giving up something right now, going through smoking withdrawal, for health effects that are mainly decades in the future, for example, if you're in your 30s or 40s. Now, I might mention as a sort of a side note about the economics of all this, addiction isn't necessarily irrational. Earlier, I was getting my cup of coffee because it's still morning here in Ithaca, and I think I am addicted to caffeine, and I don't think that's an irrational addiction. But addiction does mean that past decision-making errors can continue to affect problems, and so there is an important exacerbation of the fact that a lot of teens start smoking and may be making mistakes back then, becoming addicted to it, and now as adults have to deal with the addiction that they have from their adolescent selves. So with these market failures, what nicotine regulatory policy should do is should try to shift smokers into reduced risk nicotine products. In particular, I think these policies to improve consumer information have a great deal of potential. And again, Professor Matthews will talk some more about that. Before I want to go on to a little bit more about information and cost-benefit analysis, I wanted to point out that market failures or individual failures are a necessary but not sufficient condition. So that means that these policies might be a good idea, but they don't prove that they're necessarily a good idea. And in particular, it might be tempting to use very strict regulations to try to move people from smoking into vaping. But there, it's much less clear that the benefits will be greater than the cost. And we've done we have work in progress of doing a cost-benefit analysis of a US FDA proposal to prohibit menthol cigarettes. So our analysis or our data analysis should suggest that if you prohibit menthol cigarettes, a lot of menthol smokers will shift to menthol e-cigarettes if they're available on the market. So it is part of this shifting idea. A lot of them also, unfortunately, our model predicts, our data suggests, might be very interested in continuing to smoke menthol cigarettes but purchasing them on the illegal market. So because of that, we estimate the opportunity cost of a prohibition would be quite substantial, $24 billion a year. We also think there'll be an illegal market that will at least create another $10 billion of extra cost to supply illegal cigarettes. In terms of those secondhand smoke externalities, using FDA estimates, we estimate that the benefits would be about $18.9 billion a year. So at this point, the cost-benefit analysis, and sort of a neoclassical analysis of the cost imposed on consumers versus the benefits to reducing the externality, it doesn't pass the benefit cost test. Adding in reduced internalities is our next step, and that might change the bottom line. So I want to continue to talk about benefit cost analysis. Let me just give a little bit of an advertisement for the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis as well, and also what Professor Harberger in 1972 suggested should be the motto of such a society. And you see this equation down there that I'm not going to try to pronounce. I don't know if there might be simultaneous translation into other languages here, but that would be a very difficult equation to translate into languages. But I mean, the benefit cost analysis is a complicated business, but it provides this useful guidance. I'll mention, by the way, that on the far left there of the screen is Professor Harberger, who celebrated his 100th birthday this past summer. I was chatting with him at a Society for Benefit Cost Analysis meeting a few years ago. He mentioned that he had stopped smoking in 1972. So I guess the 50 years of life he's had left shows the value of quitting smoking even when he was in his 50s, I guess. I'm trying to do all the math in my head. What I want to finish with is just sketching some discussions of a couple of different cost-benefit analyses of how we could go about it. One is a paper that I published about in 2015 in the Journal of Benefit Cost Analysis that talks about or estimates the cost-benefit analysis of informing consumers about the risk of smoking. And this was basically a retrospective analysis of what happened in the US. And it develops an approach and shows a case study of an approach to take into account these ideas of bad information and says, look, what happened since 1964 through modern times is that the demand curve for smoking shifted inward because of informational policies. And we estimate the total cigarette consumption is 28% lower than in a counterfactual world where demand stayed the same. But then we bring in internalities by trying to figure out, so what would a rational amount of demand curve for smoking look like? And based on all that, we estimate the consumer benefits are $573 billion, which is like larger than the cigarette sales. It's hard, we don't have a hard estimate cost, but it seems to be orders of magnitude lower because so much of that information was spread very widely, relatively cheaply. I'm not going to go through too much here of the analysis of the demand of these demand curves. Again, the idea is to have both an observed demand curve, what really happened, a counterfactual demand curve to show what would have happened if there had been no information, hadn't been these demand shocks, and then a rational demand curve that we construct to use for cost-benefit analysis. And then we've got all these areas that are basically versions of the famous Harberger triangle, if you've done that kind of welfare economics. You see all these areas on this graph. I'm not going to try to go through those, but the basic idea there, again, is that in actuality, the demand curve for cigarettes shifted down, getting closer to what would be a rational amount of demand for cigarettes. Here is our estimates of what would have happened in the counterfactual fraction of smoking. If, again, where we see that the fraction of smokers dropped from 40% down to 15%, now it's below 10% in the US. And this is what we estimate would have happened to counterfactual cigarette consumption per year. Again, because people would have continued to smoke rather than what really happened. in the dotted line. And finally, we have a comparison of the rational consumption versus cigarette consumption. And this basically takes into account what I was saying earlier, is that given that people were addicted, for a lot of them, it wasn't rational to totally quit, but it was rational to drop their addiction consumption and to look at much more like a pattern like that blue line. So that's a completed benefit cost analysis of a past policy. Now, that's great to sort of pat ourselves on the back, so to speak, and say this massive public health win. This is what Kenneth Warner has called one of the greatest public health achievements in the second half of the 20th century in high-income countries, has been to reduce that. And there's still great potential for those kind of reductions in low and middle-income countries. But particularly looking forward, we want to think about the cost-benefit analysis of informing consumers about the lower relative risk of vaping. And in the same kind of way, we need to develop an estimate of how much improved information will shift the demand curve, and then we can conduct cost-benefit analysis with reference to a rational demand curve for vaping that shows the demand for fully informed consumers. And for this, we'd need to have demand elasticities. We'd have to have estimates of the demand of the size of the internality. But the basic economic approach would be something like this, that in this case, the demand for vaping needs to shift out to become more rational because so many smokers are poorly informed about the actual relative risk of vaping. So many of them would make themselves better off and would make society better off if they shifted from smoking into vaping. And the potential, that Harvard triangle there in blue, is the potential gains from an informational policy that could shift the observed demand curve out closer to the rational demand curve. At the very end here, I just want to sort of to wrap up my talk about cost-benefit analysis to point out that cost-benefit analysis, again, is about whether resources are in their most highly valued use. And so, given that market failures exist in the smoking and vaping markets, societal resources used to make cigarettes would be more valuable if they were used to make e-cigarettes. So that would be a change in equilibrium, from one equilibrium to another, where there's less smoking and more vaping. Now, of course, there are going to be a lot of other impacts that change would have. There are a lot of stakeholders that would be affected. And the stakeholders, of course, affect the smokers. And cost-benefit analysis tries to take that into account. The non-smokers exposed to secondhand smoke. And cost-benefit analysis tries to take that into account. The other stakeholders, though, include like tobacco manufacturers and growers, e-cigarette manufacturers, the tax revenues, finance offices. A lot of those are not exactly the same as the economic efficiency issues. A lot of those is this reallocation of resources from low societal value to high societal value uses, and do not actually end up contributing a net benefit or a net cost to society to be counted in a cost-benefit analysis. So what cost-benefit analysis provides is a systematic and disciplined way of keeping track of the benefits and costs and to avoid double counting, etc. At the same time, it's very interesting to do estimates, for example, of the public health impacts of these changes. And actually, we saw some of those. The Mendez and Warner simulation models are very similar to the work that David Levy does that Professor Pelosa cited. But I just, as I said, I wanted to be sure that it's, recognizing that, the goal of cost-benefit analysis and the goal of public policy should not be trying to maximize government revenue. It shouldn't be trying to maximize manufacturer profits. It even shouldn't be aimed at maximizing public health. We need to maximize social welfare, and sometimes that does not necessarily coincide with maximizing public health. That we could all be healthier and yet to a large, at least in some cases, that might not make us better off in a broader sense when we think about the cost of trying to achieve some kind of maximum health for each of us. So that kind of comes to my last point, my last slide. I'll end with another quote that I've always enjoyed from Thomas Sowell, a very famous economist, not health economist, but he wasn't talking about vaping and smoking here, but just in general about public policy. There are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And so benefit cost analysis, again, is a systematic way to help society evaluate those trade-offs. And that's, I hope, what a lot of economists contribute are various inputs and then finally the completed benefit cost analysis to complete these benefit cost analyses and to help society make the best decisions about how to regulate nicotine products. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kenkel. Now, I would like to continue with Professor Ellen Matthews' presentation. The floor is yours. Virtual floor is yours. And you are muted, Professor Matthews.
Okay.
Yeah.
So same disclosure as Professor Kenkel. This work is supported by a grant from Global Action to End Smoking. Also, I have a cold, so my voice may come in and out, so I apologize for that. Here's my my organization, my presentation. It's going to fit very well with both what Professor Kenkel was talking about, and Professor Pelosi was talking about. So we're in a weird situation where there's so much evidence of the relative benefits of e-cigarettes, but for some reason, and I'm going to try to trace some of the reasons, consumers have huge misinformation about these relative risks. So I'm going to present data on cross-country risk perceptions on the relative risks of e-cigarettes relative to cigarettes. I'm going to talk about another measure of perceptions of risk by how consumers believe how many life years will be lost if they continue to smoke cigarettes versus e-cigarettes. I'll go over the main takeaways that we should take from these data. And then we're going to try to link these perceptions to how governments talk about e-cigarettes, and then present an experiment where we actually vary in an experiment how two governments, the UK and the US, provided information and tried to measure whether that change in government information actually changes risk perceptions. And then I'll reflect, given I've been working in this harm reduction area for decades, how we're in a very similar situation we were now with e-cigarettes as we were with reduced harm approaches towards food products in about 40 years ago. So that's going to be my my advancing is not, there we go. Okay, so Professor Kenkel and I have been doing data collection across many, many countries, and we asked the identical question in our surveys across these countries. And we basically ask, relative to cigarettes, do you believe e-cigarettes are less harmful, much less harmful, more harmful, much more harmful, et cetera? And here are the results across many countries. And you can see the state, the kind of dismal state of perception. So the percent of consumers that believe e-cigarettes are less or much less harmful. You can see in most countries, only 30-40% of consumers believe that they're less or much less harmful. And in terms of much more or much more harmful, you see a decent percent of consumers believing they're more harmful. And the most common category is often equally harmful. And so the blue line is really the percent of people who get it correct. And you can see, again, the state in some countries, this is really, really poor. So for example, if you look at Australia and the United States, you see only 25-30% of people are actually getting it correct. Okay. Then, if we ask the question, basically, we say a typical person, if they has a lifespan of, let's say, 76. What do you think the lifespan of someone who's been vaping or smoking is? And from that answer, we can compute their perceived life years lost due to smoking and vaping. And so, again, these same across all these countries, you see several what I think are very interesting facts here. First of all, the vertical line on the orange vertical line is the consensus estimate of the actual life years lost from smoking. And based on a lot of the evidence that Ricardo showed earlier, the consensus estimate of perhaps life years lost from vaping being much, much lower. So you can see those two vertical lines. And if you look at the blue lines, you could see that across every country, way overestimate of the life years lost from vaping. And some countries are way below life years lost from smoking. So you could see that might be why smoking rates are high in some countries. And in the countries where life years lost from smoking are about accurate, you can see, again, dramatic differences across countries in this perception of life years lost from smoking. But across all countries, way overestimate of life years lost from vaping. The other very interesting thing, and I'll summarize my takeaways from this, is how correlated the perceptions of life years lost from vaping are with life years lost from smoking. So this is very consistent with Viscusi's Bayesian model of how you update information. Since e-cigarettes are correlated in sort of purpose with smoking, people's original risk perceptions of smoking seem to carry over potentially to their risk perceptions of vaping. And so how to break this correlation is extremely, extremely important. So again, what I want you to take away from these charts are the following. The US and Australia have the lowest percentage of consumers perceiving e-cigarettes to be less or much less harmful. US and Australia have the highest perceived life years lost due to vaping, way above what the science suggests. Perceptions of life years lost from vaping are very correlated, as I said, with smoking. And the UK had the largest gap in the correct direction between perceptions of life years lost from vaping and life years lost from smoking. Asian countries perceive lower life years lost from smoking, which then correlates with lower life years lost from vaping because they're so correlated. And then I want to ask the question, might these results be impacted by how governments message about smoking and vaping? So I did a scan of these countries' websites, government websites, and here's what I found. And there's so much they put up there. Some countries put very little up. So here's some of the, so remember, Australia had almost the worst amount of consumers, most misinformation, where consumers really, really thought e-cigarettes were not less harmful than cigarettes. So here's what they say, and I won't, I have screens and screens of this, but all of this is very, very negative about e-cigarettes in terms of what they do. They one of the most effective ways in my other research I found of getting people to think e-cigarettes are bad are to list ingredients. And so formaldehyde, acetone, these very scientific sounding toxic type things. Here's what Australia is focusing on when they talk about e-cigarettes. In the slides, whenever you see an italicized thing, that's the only somewhat positive thing they say. So I'll go on. Government messaging in Australia, again, more just antifreeze, polyester compounds. The only positive, slightly positive things that the Australian government officially says on their website is that e-cigarettes do not produce the tar found in conventional cigarettes, which is the main cause of lung cancer. And then they say, however, immediately, many scientists are concerned that vaping increases lung disease, heart disease, and cancer, which is not true. So, okay, in the United States, the next worst country in terms of the biggest levels of misinformation about whether e-cigarettes are less harmful than cigarettes. Here's selected statements from the CDC website, which is different than the FDA. So the FDA is a more sort of what I would say a more balanced view, but the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the United States, is sort of one of the main information communicators. So they start off, no tobacco products, including e-cigarettes, are safe. Most e-cigarettes contain nicotine, a health danger for pregnant people, developing fetuses and youth. Aerosol can contain potentially harmful substances. And then the only positive thing that you can see is e-cigarettes may have the potential to benefit adults who smoke and are not pregnant if used as a complete substitute. Okay? More messaging in the United States. Toxic to fetuses, health danger for pregnant, acute nicotine exposure can be toxic. Again, very negative towards e-cigarettes in the CDC information space. And it goes on and on. It's sort of all consistent with very negative views. Now, the UK, which had one of the more, in terms of the risk perception data I showed, had actually one of the highest percentage of people get it correct, that e-cigarettes are less harmful than cigarettes. Here's what they say on their public websites, in government websites. And the italicized are the positives. And you can see extreme positive perspective that the government is trying to get out there in terms of the benefits of e-cigarettes. And so, and you could read these at your leisure. The presentation will be available for you. But all very positive, substantially less harmful than smoking. It's one of the most effective tools for quitting smoking. Right up front, first line when you go to the government health website. So that's the main point I want to make, that these risk perception data I showed seems to be very correlated with government messaging and how the governments portray e-cigarettes. But we can't deduce causality from correlations. And so we went on to the next, and this is more of what the government says in the UK. So we went on and tried to do a little experiment to see, is there some causation between government messaging and risk perceptions? Okay, so what we did was we exposed in an experiment UK consumers to the US messaging when EVALI happened, which was the electronic vaping associated lung injury, where in 2019, late in 2019, there were sudden hospitalizations and deaths of young people who at first thought they were vaping e-cigarettes, but it turned out they were vaping THC, illegal black market products. There was some confusion about that early on, but there was a lot of immediate messaging about how to react to these sudden injuries that were being identified in hospitals by young people using vaping technology. So we exposed UK consumers to the US messaging about that. We exposed UK consumers to the UK messaging, about their own messaging about it. We exposed US consumers to the UK messaging, US consumers to the US messaging, and looked at how those different exposures changed risk perceptions. And so here's just to give you a sense of how the UK dealt with the EVALI crisis. Our advice on e-cigarettes remains unchanged. Vaping isn't completely risk-free, but is far less harmful than smoking tobacco. So you can see immediately the UK was worried about people believing e-cigarettes were going to be very harmful in response to these. And this EVALI, even though it happened in the United States, became a worldwide sort of of information shock. In the UK, in the US, lung injury products was recently reported in most states. The CDC is investigating, recommends considering refraining from using e-cigarettes and vaping products. So we show, again, our treatment, information treatment, is to show these actually, the information that governments actually use, the US and the UK, and see how people respond. This was done about a year and a half ago, this data. And so here's the quick summary of results. When the US sample was exposed to the UK message, you see right here a significant increase in the percent of US consumers who believed that e-cigarettes are less harmful. On a mean of where 22% of US consumers believe that, you see that's a huge percent increase from 2.22, the mean of 0.22, and it went up by 0.07. And you see most of that came from people believing that fewer people saying that it was less than harmful. When the US sample sees the US message and are exposed to the one that actually happened in the US, you can see that you have a big increase in more harmful. So this is sort of a sense that information provided by government is causal in terms of affecting risk perceptions. When we go to the UK version, so this is now the UK sample, we see that when they see their own message, they an increase again in more people believing that that e-cigarettes are less harmful, and it comes again from this. It comes again from It comes again from moving people from just as harmful to less harmful. So we were quite impressed with government messaging. Does seem to influence risk perceptions in an important way, and that in fact there's some hope that if governments change their messaging, that in fact you can change risk perceptions, which are so fundamentally important to moving to what Don talked about of getting people's demand for e-cigarettes up in a full information environment. But even with these changes, do I have much hope that governments are going to fundamentally change the way they talk about e-cigarettes? I am not that hopeful about that. So I wanted you to, and I just summarized what I've just been talking about here. So I come with a sort of a dismal hope that governments are going to be able to react and incorporate the information that Ricardo talked about at the beginning and start changing the way they think about e-cigarettes. I think that there's virtually no chance that WHO will do that. So what kind of hope do we have that we can actually change risk perceptions? So again, Ricardo talked about physicians being misinformed. I mean, how is this going to happen? And so I sort of think back to my original work on harm reduction and want to make the analogy of where the food industry was back in the 80s. So just to give you a little sense of history here and where I see hope is when food manufacturers started trying to highlight the risk reduction attributes of some food. So yeah, a certain type of food is not great, but we can reduce the amount of saturated fat or fat in the product and make it less harmful. The government would not allow, in the US, the Food and Drug Administration would not allow firms to make any disease prevention claim about any aspects of their product. So if for example, if soda removed the sugar in their product, there's no way they were allowed to make any claim about reduced sugar and harm. If they reduced the fat, they couldn't make any benefit claim of reduced fat. And this went on for years and years, for 20 years, 30 years after the science suggested that reducing fat can actually, in food, can actually have huge potential positive impacts on reduced risks of cancer and heart disease. Finally, and part of the reason was exactly the demonization of food manufacturers, just like demonization of firms producing e-cigarettes. we can't depend ever on firms making any useful information about their products. They just motivated to make profits, and they won't be truthful. How in the world, why we would ever allow them to make any claims? Well, this changed in the 80s, where firms were all of a sudden sort of challenged. They put a lot of pressure on the government to allow to make higher fiber claims, that higher fiber foods could make a difference in people's food consumption and reduce risk of cancer. And finally, the government relented. So I just want to show you 3 slides, and I'll finish with that, to show you how dramatic when you added the private sector and firms being able to talk about the value of their own products in a truthful way, because these ads were very regulated for truthfulness, and how dramatic the impact was. So here's what happened right after private sector advertising began. This is knowledge that fiber and cancer are linked. For years and years, everybody was concerned that people aren't getting enough fiber in their diets. From 1978 to 1984, very little increase in knowledge despite government messaging, you should eat more fiber, you should eat more fiber. The second the private sector started talking about this in their advertising and their promotion, huge increases in knowledge across all education groups. If you look at the actual consumption of fiber, once the government allowed private sector firms to talk about this and promote it with aggressive advertising, you could see a huge increase in the fiber content of cereals consumed. And then finally, in the entire American diet, once these advertisements started, it spread across all products, all food products, huge amount of advertising. And you could see this reductions in the American diet between coming down slightly from their 1977 levels. All of a sudden, firms are promoting the disease prevention attributes of reducing fat, et cetera, both fat, saturated fat, et cetera. And you can see the dramatic declines in the American diet of how much on average fat they were consuming a day. So the main point here is that where I see hope, and I almost see the only hope, is that eventually firms that make reduced harm products will have to be able to promote and talk about their products relative to cigarettes. And if we can at first I said, there's no way that can happen in sort of our current political climates. But again, this is exactly where food was way back, where I would admit nobody ever thought they'd ever enter a world where firms would be so aggressive in being able to promote health-related health claims for their food products. Let's hope that the same transition can happen with e-cigarettes, where firms can make truthful advertisements about their products. The amount of resources and total amount of resources devoted to that information dissemination would dwarf any government trying to even make those claims, because if you take the entire harm reduction industry and allow them to aggressively talk about the benefits of these products, consistent with all of what Ricardo was talking about at the beginning, I think we'd be in a very different world, and the consumption of switching from cigarettes to e-cigarettes would dramatically increase. That's my talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Matios, for the great presentation. Our next speaker, who is with us this afternoon, is Professor August Straip Hidayet. Can you share your presentation with us, please?
Yes. Thank you for apprising me and calling me as a professor, Dr. Asena. Very good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear my voice clearly? Mas Pugu?
Yes, crystal clear.
Okay. What happened? It can be displayed as presentation. No. Okay. My name is Agus. So on behalf of the research team from the Indonesian Development Foundation, so I'm going to present our research with the title Consumers' Perception and Decision Making Regarding Tobacco Harm Reduction Products. It's evidence from discrete choice experiments in Indonesia. What happens? I can't move my slide.
Gus, do you want me to share the slides for
Okay.
you?
Yeah. Should be okay. Okay. Yeah. Similar to previous speakers, we would like to disclose that this research was supported by Global Action to End Smoking. However, they have not been involved in designing, interpreting, or analyzing the study. For the background, why Indonesia is interesting for
the
this
slides
study.
are not proceeding. We're still seeing the title page.
Oh, I see. My
Could
colleague,
you-
Mas Pugu, could you please
could you-
share your screen?
Yes, could you please stop? Yes. Okay, I'll
yeah.
share my screen.
Yeah, apology for this technical issue.
Yep.
Could
Can
you please,
everyone see my
move
screen?
to the background?
Is it on presentation mode already?
Yes, in my screen it is. Please go to the background.
Yes. Yes, everything is working well now. Thank you.
Thank you. So again, why Indonesian context is interesting for this tobacco study. So Indonesia is the second largest tobacco product market in the world, with about 70 million Indonesians are active smokers, and only about 10% of the smokers are cigarette users, and only half of the cigarette users are the active daily e-cigarette users. We know that quitting smoking is not easy, so it is difficult for most. And for the Indonesian context, this to some extent has led to high mortality rate, high disability adjusted life years, etc. And also the claim on health insurance to the National Health Insurance Program is also increasing over time because of the increasing disease related attributed to tobacco. And many literatures provide evidence, including the ones mentioned by Professor Polosa, mentioned by Professor Kenkel, and also Professor Alan Matthews, that tobacco harm reduction products such as e-cigarettes emerge as potential strategies to offer a viable alternative to combustible cigarette as a means for smoking cessation methods. Unfortunately, in the Indonesian context, the research on this issue, especially on the perception of the consumers on the tobacco, especially the tobacco harm reduction product, is still limited, and we try to fill this gap. Next, please. And then the primary objective of our study is to understand the drivers behind consumer behavior regarding their decision to select combustible cigarette, e-cigarettes, and also smoking cessation. And specifically, we would like to address and to explore how the attributes such as price, flavor, nicotine levels affect their decision to select these three options. Next, please. We did literature review both by looking at the preference-based perspectives and choice-based decision-making theories. And the main view say that consumers often make choices based on the utility maximization. However, their decisions are also influenced by the contextual framing. And next, please. Next, please, Mas. And in terms of tobacco harm reduction product, various factors such as health risk factor and then brand trust and reputation, and also the sensitivity of the price play a crucial role in shaping the consumer perception. Next, please. So based on that background and the literature review, we tested three key hypotheses that focusing on the price and then flavors and nicotine levels. Yeah. So we collected the data by using two methods. First is using online survey. This was conducted by IDF teams in collaboration with SSRS, United States. And then also we did focus group discussion with experts and also with the smokers, both combustible cigarette smokers and e-cigarette smokers. And then the survey design, we employ discrete choice experiments, and the detail for DCE can be seen in the next slide. Please. Yeah, the respondent is the smokers age 18 and above, in which it is the legal age in Indonesian regulation to do smoking. Even though in the statistic we found so many underage smokers, but we disregard those under 18. And then the experimental design in DC model, so we put attributes like a price and then nicotine levels and flavor. So we gave the respondents like three options of cigarette price, three options of e-cigarette price, three options of nicotine levels, and also flavor availability. So in total, we have 81 possible attribute combination. And then each respondent were presented with 12 tasks here, in which attribute to those three options: combustible cigarette, electric cigarette, or quitting. And then for benchmarking, we refer to the Indonesian Socioeconomic Survey, or SUSENAS, in determining the province, the region, the population, etc. Finally, we collected about 627 smokers as a respondent, and these samples fully utilized based on outcome. Next, please. Yeah. Next, Mas Bu. Yeah, okay. Yeah, this is the attributes and options I mentioned briefly before. Next, please. Yeah, for the data analysis, we use a descriptive statistic, and also we examine the DCE data we collected by using three regression models. First is linear probability models and logistic regression models, and also the McFadden conditional logit regression models. So using these three instruments to examine, give us a multidimensional analysis. Okay, let's see. Yeah, okay, this is the descriptive statistic. We found that the majority respondents are daily smoker with most preference on combustible cigarette. The average of the number spent for vaping last month it was about 11.8 times. And then while we found that combustible cigarette remained the dominant choice, we found there is a gradual shift toward a cigarette and quitting. If we see the choice of 6 months from now, so the percentage of using combustible cigarette is getting lower, and then the e-cigarette is slightly higher, and the quit also is slightly higher. Next, please. Yeah, in terms of demography, we found that the sample mostly are male in the age group of 25 to 39, the productive age range, with most respondents having at least a bachelor degree in terms of the education, and mostly are living in Java Island. So as the largest inhabited island, yeah, most populous island in Indonesia, about 60% of the population are living in Java Island.
Hi,
And,
sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt, but for the sake of
Yeah.
time, could we move to take a look at your results,
The result?
your findings?
Yes, sure.
Great,
sure,
great.
Sure. Can this result support the statement of the Professor Paulosa, Professor Kenkel, and Professor Allen that we found evident that there is a tendency of misperception, yeah, from both male and female smokers who see that e-cigarette as harmful or more harmful than a traditional cigarette. So yeah, a public campaign is matters in this. Next, please. And then similar thing, we found evidence that misperceptions happens when we ask about the nicotine cigarette as the cause of the cancer, and most of the respondents agree, while we know that the tar and other dangerous chemical part as the main sources. Next, please. This is the estimation result from the linear probability model. So our finding found that the price is the only factors affecting the consumers to select either to stay with combustible cigarette, e-cigarette, or quitting. Yeah. Those three model, LPM and then logistic and McFadden model, they have a similar pattern that price is the most effective factors for this preference. Please move to next slide, Mas Pugu. Go to the discussion finding. Yeah. Next, please. Okay. So we found that for on and cross price elasticity, that higher combustible cigarette price correspond to a lower likelihood of choosing combustible cigarette, and higher likelihood of choosing e-cigarette. So there's possibility of switching from a combustible cigarette to a cigarette when the price of combustible cigarette is rising. Similar thing for the e-cigarette, that higher e-cigarette price correspond to a lower likelihood of choosing e-cigarette, and there is a possibility of switching to combustible cigarette. The result for now and the 6 months later is quite similar. The different thing is in the magnitude one. Next, please. Next, please. We will skip this discussion. So for the hypothesis 2, it is unfortunate. Previous slide, Mas Pugu. We didn't found any evidence that flavor and nicotine levels saw a significant impact. So only price matters. Next, please. And for the socio-demographic characteristic, we found that female smokers are more likely to choose e-cigarette. And yeah, there is no significant effect for females on quitting behaviors on current and 6 months selection. And for the age, we found that millennials and Generation X are more likely to smoke cigarettes. So the older generations are inclined to quit smoking compared to younger age group. And then we found that Gen Z tend to like to smoke e-cigarette compared to the older generation. And in terms of income, yeah, we found that higher income increases the likelihood of choosing e-cigarettes. So this could be affected by the price of the e-cigarette in Indonesia is relatively high. So the e-cigarette is imposed of maximum tariff of 57% plus 10% local tax. Yeah, next please. Yeah, for the discussion that we can say that the tobacco products are price sensitive in Indonesia. So yeah, this indicates that the price intervention could effectively influence consumer behavior, especially for these e-cigarettes, yeah, as we mentioned before. And then yeah, to provide incentive to switch to a less harmful cigarette. So making e-cigarette more financially attractive is important. It is as an incentive for transition to smoking cessation. Yeah, we found that it can potentially reduce the health risk and burden associated with smoking. And yeah, it is in line with previous studies also mentioned by Professor Paulus, Professor Kenkel, and Professor Allen in their presentation. And also the significant negative relationship between combustible cigarette price and e-cigarette price choice indicates that lower price for e-cigarette would promote daily use over cigarette. In one paper in the case of Malaysia, it is mentioned that nearly 90% of current e-cigarette users were either current or former of combustible cigarettes. So the possibility of shifting to the less harmful product, if it is incentivized, quite bigger. Okay, so this is the conclusion, and yeah, you all can read and would like to see the implication. Next, Mas. Yeah, for the implication, yeah, policy recommendation include implementing like price control or price adjustment through certain instruments such as taxation to reduce combustible cigarettes and to motivate the smoker to switch to e-cigarette is method. And then, yeah, we see that the public health campaign promoting the benefit of switching to e-cigarette as a harm reduction tool are essential, especially targeting older smokers and young smokers to avoid their initiation to smoke. Yeah, that's all from us. And then we would like to acknowledge the support and advice from Professor Kenkel and Professor Alan Matthews for the study. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hidayat. And in this panel, finally, we will be listening to Professor James Prieger's presentation, who kindly shared with us a pre-recording. Now we will watch his video. Basically, he unfortunately, because of the time difference, couldn't join us live.
Good afternoon, everyone. I thank the organizers for the chance to contribute to today's discussion on opportunities and challenges provided by reduced harm tobacco products. We will be talking about some work that Sam Hampshire and I have done that relates to this topic. Illicit markets in tobacco products are a large problem around the world, although the scale of the problem varies greatly by country. In the context of e-cigarettes, it is important to note that many countries have found it difficult to keep counterfeit, unregulated, unapproved, or otherwise illicit products off of the market. Certainly that's been the case here in the United States. What I want to focus on today is an opportunity that e-cigarettes might offer for reducing problems with illicit markets for combustible cigarettes. Let's begin with considering some of the main policies adopted for tobacco control around the world. Examples of such policies to reduce cigarette smoking might include the following: higher prices by raising taxes, purchase restrictions of various sorts, or bans on particular products. Leading example for this talk will be banning menthol or other flavored cigarettes, although the analysis will apply more generally. All such policies raise the question of how smokers will respond. We cannot assume that smokers will do what we want them to just because we want them to do it. To the contrary, economics teaches policymakers to watch out for unintended consequences of regulation. In the face of a product ban, some smokers may quit all nicotine use. So far, so good. Others will switch to other nicotine products, perhaps including reduced harm products, such as e-cigarettes. However, some smokers' responses to the ban may bring about new harms that undermine the benefits of whatever restriction you began with. In particular, a ban could stimulate demand for illicit tobacco products. Illicit trade in tobacco products already has a strong foothold in the US, for example, where between 4% to 21%, depending on where and how you measure it, of cigarettes sold are estimated to be untaxed or otherwise illicit. Now, harms from illicit trade are many, and they include lost tax revenue, increased tobacco use and less quitting because of lower prices on the black market, violence and other ills stemming from organized crime, and funding for terrorism around the world. Consider whether e-cigarettes, however, can help alleviate illicit trade after a ban. The logic is simple. Much research, including ours, shows that e-cigarettes are economic substitutes for cigarettes. Illicit cigarettes are also, of course, substitutes for the legal product that would be banned. If e-cigarettes remain legally available, then some consumers who otherwise may have sought the illicit market will turn to e-cigarettes instead. That is, e-cigarettes can act as a safety valve for consumer demand that otherwise might have gone to illegal products. So we attempt to look for and quantify this possibility. So, how to study the impact of a product ban? We can rely on the well-developed theory of what happens when prices change for an economic good. This is because conceptually, a ban on a product is just a particular form and a rather extreme price change for the banned good. That is, banning a product is conceptually identical from the standpoint of microeconomic price theory to raising its price at or above the maximum willingness to pay of all consumers, shown by the red dot in the figure here. In short, a ban or restriction is like an extreme price change. And we know from economics what happens when a good's price rises. Some people will turn to substitutes. An obvious substitute in the present situation is illicit supply of the banned goods. Viewing a ban as a price increase allows us to examine data that are readily available, how increasing the price of cigarettes is related to the substitute good of illicit cigarettes, and, important for today's talk, how the availability of a robust legal market for e-cigarettes might mitigate that link. So we put together a data set from countries around the world where there is much variation in prices, illicit trade, and the size of e-cigarette markets, both across countries and across time. We estimate an econometric model for the determinants of the quantity of illicit cigarettes sold in a country and year. The key policy-related variable was the price of cigarettes, But control variables also included income per capita, a measure of corruption in the country and year fixed effects. The econometric methods included fixed effects and instrumental variables, or IV estimation, in particular estimated by a generalized method of moments estimator, where the cigarette prices were instrumented with the ad valorem tax rate and the specific excise tax on cigarettes. In the regression equation for illicit cigarettes, there are two coefficients of main interest. Beta 1, shown in the equation in blue, is for the prices of legal cigarettes. So beta 1 shows whether raising prices causes substitution towards illicit markets. Keep in mind that the dependent variable here, y, is a measure of illicit markets for cigarettes. Beta 2, on the other hand, the other coefficient in blue, allows that link to be moderated by the size of e-cigarette markets in the country, as measured by END's revenue. This is because beta 2 multiplies the cross product of both e-cigarette revenue and licit cigarette prices. So a positive beta 2 implies that there is such a moderating effect. Let's look now at some results. So in these results that I'm showing at the moment, beta 1 is in the first row. This first set of results show that higher cigarette prices indeed are associated with larger illicit markets, as economic theory suggests. This is because the figure highlighted in blue there, 0.612, which is an elasticity. This is the elasticity of illicit cigarette quantity consumed with respect to changes in cigarette prices, is both positive and statistically significant. That has been shown by other studies, including some previous work that I did with another co-author in the past. Our more interesting result and novel to this work comes from the estimates of beta 2, here shown in the third row in blue in this slide. The larger the e-cigarette market is in the country, the smaller is the positive connection between cigarette prices and illicit trade. That is, e-cigarettes appear to attenuate the degree to which higher cigarette prices stimulate the illicit market. And this is coming from the negative coefficients shown there in blue, and again, they are highly statistically significant. Well, looking at tables of numbers is one thing. For those of us who are a little more visual, this graph shows how the illicit cross-price elasticity changes with the size of the e-cigarette market. The vertical axis here measures the impact of cigarette prices on illicit trade. That is to say, it is the price coefficient beta 1 as modified by beta 3 and the size of the e-cigarette market. It's the marginal effect. The other axis, the horizontal axis, is the size of e-cigarette markets. So the plotted thick blue line there is the marginal effect of e-cigarettes and how it's impacted by e-cigarette revenue. That is downward sloping. So that is showing that the link between cigarette prices and illicit markets is lower where e-cigarette markets are larger. And in fact, this is also true when the moderating factor is considered to be all reduced harm tobacco products instead of just e-cigarettes. So here, the horizontal axis is capturing revenue not just from e-cigarettes, but also heated tobacco products, snus, oral nicotine, and so forth. Smokeless tobacco. That's another one. So again, the link between cigarette prices and illicit markets is lower where RHTP markets are larger. And that comes from the fact that that marginal effect is sloping down in the graph. So in conclusion, in addition to direct harm reduction, e-cigarettes may provide an additional policy benefit. When considering raising prices, restricting or banning combustible tobacco products, it may be important to allow for a safety valve to reduce potential unintended consequences. Keeping e-cigarettes and other RHTPs legal can provide that safety valve, our research suggests at least, to some degree for smokers, and make illicit markets relatively less attractive, while at the same time accomplishing harm reduction for those individuals. So to finish off here, let me just note there is a link here, or if this go by too quickly, please feel free to just shoot me an email at james.prieger@pepperdine.edu. I'll be happy to send you a copy of this work, which is published at the Social Science Research Network at the moment. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the presentations and the conference.
Is it working now? Is it better?
Yeah. Yes,
Any
that's better.
Yeah, the people on Zoom can hear us, but what about the translator? Oh, okay. All right. I was just saying that we are grateful to all of the presenters in this afternoon's panel. We're grateful to you for taking the time to share your important insights with us, including Professor Poloso, including Professors Kenkel and Matios, and Prieger and Hidayet today. It's been a great panel, I think, very productive. So are there any questions? Let me ask the audience. We can take a few minutes for questions before we close the panel.
Yeah, I have a question to Professor Polosa.
Please, yes.
Yeah, Professor Polosa mentioned that vaping is much safer than conventional cigarette. Yeah. He showed us so many evidence. My questions are, first, how does vaping affect different age groups? And then, is there any research or evidence of the having effect on different ethnicity groups? And then the last one, is vaping dangerous for people with comorbidities such as people with heart or lung disease? Thank you.
I quite didn't get the first question. What was the first one?
The first one is how does vaping affect different age groups, like younger, elder, mature, senior, something like that? Is there any research on that, Professor? Thank you.
Okay, that's the easiest and I think most beautiful one. When I think that, when I say that electronic vaping are making a revolution, I just say thinking that all the people that are switching are in the vast majority in the age range of 18 to 35, 40 max. This is exactly the window of opportunity for a clinician, because after age 45, 50, there will be an accumulation of damage, some of which will be not reversible. So having a widespread popularity of this product across smokers at the very early stages when the disease is fully reversible, and I mean, there's a lot of important literature, just to mention the doctor study, which was published by Sir Richard Pato in the late 70s, and the BMJ. I mean, that to me, it's an important point to make. In relation to ethnicities, this is another important point. I think in relation to vaping, this has been less studied. Of course, we know a lot about mental impact on the black color people. But in terms of vaping, all I can say is that it's been, at least in the US, much more popular amongst the white people compared with the other subgroups. I guess one of the reasons has to do with the social affluency, because most of the vapers in the US, at least during the time of those surveys, were people coming from rich families that could afford the best product. At that time was Juul. Now things may have changed because Elf Bar is now dominating the market and other products dominating the market, but I do not have any ethnicity, granularity data offhand. And I think the last one is about, pre-existing diseases, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong. What's the impact on
Yes, correct.
Okay. This third question relates directly to the first question. Let me just give you an example. I'm not sure if you'll just look at the data that I was presenting about the COPD patients, that there were improvements. Maybe not so much, because by definition, lung function should not be reversible in COPD. But the real question is, what type of COPD patients have you enrolled in that study? The answer is, because of ethical reasons, and I was asked to stand up, I'll just stay here so that I'll be in the camera. For ethical reasons, we could not include people on stage 4 and 5, which have more advanced disease, not only for ethical reasons, also for safety reasons, because it was one of the first study in the world looking into this effect. But mind you, these people were buying the product themselves. We were not offering any product. So it was an observational studies in any case. But the bottom line is that all the people who acquired the vaping products in the late 2012, 11, and then on subsequent years, I mean, of course, there's been transition from a product to another, even heat no burns at a certain stage, where people with a disease that was clearly reversible. And in fact, if you look at the average age in that particular study, you will note that on average, people had an age of about 50 years old. If they were much older, I would suspect I would not have seen any, not even significant, but most important, not in clinical improvement. This is not surprising, because even in smoking cessation studies, just look at the lung health study, which is the largest study in the world looking at the effect of smoking cessation. Even after few years, if you isolate people with more advanced COPD disease, you will see basically nothing in terms of improvement in their respiratory endpoints. Does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
I have an additional question to Professor Pelosi. So the FDA has sort of, and it was showed up in what I showed, that what the FDA what the CDC puts on their website, is a huge acceptance of this notion that nicotine affects the adolescent brain. And this comes from some limited number of animal studies where rats are exposed to high levels of nicotine. Do you have any, are you aware of any research taking on that claim, and because it has a lot of credibility in government agencies, and so I just wanted to know if you knew of any studies that dismiss or challenge that claim.
There is quite a limited number of studies carried out in young people who have been smoking for a certain period of time, meaning that they started smoking when they were 12 or 13. So we should assume there were some neuronal plasticity going on, all right? But, the data was very conflicting for a number of reasons. Small sample size, the endpoints were not sensitive enough. And then, again, these studies were carried out with cigarettes. And correct me if I'm wrong, when you smoke, you're not just inhaling nicotine, you're inhaling just another plethora of different chemicals, including IMAO, the inhibitors that may have some impact on the brain. So this reminds me a critique that I wrote against the Surgeon General in I guess it was 10 years ago, 8 or 10 years ago, when they declared the war to nicotine, when in fact the whole report was full of cigarette data. I said, you cannot say anything about nicotine in isolation because you haven't shown even a single study of nicotine in isolation. So this is a new era. I think this is the time that we can start looking into impact of nicotine in isolation. I'm not saying clean nicotine for the respect of CDC and FDA officials, but this is the right time that we can do the difference, and we can just look at the absolute effects of nicotine at several levels. Probably you're aware that we launched last year the first global study looking at the respiratory health effects of vapers who never smoked in their life. Why is this important? Because a previous smoking history is a confounder that cannot be dealt with statistical juggling. You know, either you had this history or you hadn't. So we were lucky enough to have selected more than 1,000 vapers who never smoked in their life, according to the WHO definition. And we are actually currently looking at respiratory health effects, including symptoms in the future, high-resolution CT scans applied to artificial intelligence, software analysis, image analysis, and so forth. In terms of cognition, to be honest, I haven't thought about that, but if you are interested, we can communicate and we can introduce some simple cognitive questionnaire or some simple cognitive test to see whether the chronic use of clean nicotine can alter some functions.
Great. I'd love to have an a private conversation about that.
Fantastic. Thank you.
It's time, I think. I think it's time to close. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay, a quick one maybe, yes.
O zaman şimdi ben Sosyal Güvenlik Kurumu'nda çalışıyorum. Yani sağlık geri ödemesini yapıyoruz Türkiye'de. Bizim Tamam. Heh. Ben SGK Sosyal Güvenlik Kurumu'nda çalışıyorum. Biz bundan 10 sene önce yani 2011'de
Direct translation Turkish to Turkish, so didn't make much sense.
Şimdi şu an tamam. Sosyal Güvenlik Kurumu'nda çalışıyorum. Biz 2011'de bir çalışma yapmıştık. Bu Dünya Bankası ile birlikte. Sigaranın direkt maliyetlerinin bizim kuruma etkisi. Orada %10, yaklaşık %10'luk bir şey bulduk. Maliyet bulduk. Şimdi bugün yapılan panelden ben şunu anladım hocam. Yani siz diyorsunuz ki bu elektronik sigara kullanımı her yönden yani işte kanser yapmıyor vesaire. Benim aklıma şöyle bir şey geldi. Yani şimdi geri ödeme kurumları mesela şu anda sigara içen işte Türkiye'de diyelim %40'lık bir oran var. Şöyle bir şey yapsa mantıklı olur mu ya da dünyada böyle bir uygulama var mı? Biz bu e-sigarayı geri ödemeye alalım örneğin. Normal sigara içenleri yapalım. Çünkü sonuçta arada tam ters bir ilişki var, kullanım ilişkisi. Birisi düşünce birisi artıyor. Sizce bu mantıklı mı ve dünyada böyle bir uygulama var mı? Yani geri ödemeye alınsa e-sigara bu şekilde sağlık harcamaları da ve insanların sağlığı kurtarılmıyor mu? Teşekkürler.
Thank you for the very important question. Very important question.
Other policy, can I mention?
Yeah.
The British government gave away e-cigarettes
Yeah, that's
in an effort
exactly.
to help people quit.
Yeah, that's what I exactly was saying. The British government is a model to follow, and New Zealand government is also another model to follow. Okay, so these governments are actively promoting vaping for the sake of smoking cessation, but I'm sure they will be looking in the long term at the impact of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and respiratory disease. Of course, for those results, we need to wait for two things. Things number one, widespread dissemination of vaping, because if the vaping remains at the 10%, we will never be able to see any major impact in terms of changes of smoking-related disease, even in the next 20, 30 years. So we need a big change, okay, to see impact. And the same in New Zealand. Of course, you see the impact with snus in Sweden. And why is that? Because more than 50, 60, and then 70% of the population over the decades have been moving away from tobacco combustible and embracing snus, which is another form of tobacco harm reduction. Also, watch out for Japan, where a massive change, a massive switch away from tobacco smoking is occurring. And the reason why I say look out for the Japanese is because they have the best way of collecting data, and through the electronic records. So I have great hopes. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for the interesting discussions. The questions, I'm sure, will never end. There are so many interesting comments and questions. We've come to the end of the panel. Please, let's give a big applause to all speakers today, morning and afternoon speakers. Deserve a big applause from us.